Hello everyone, welcome. This is our training on how to run an effective Socratic seminar, or more generally, how to employ the Socratic method in your classroom. So, let me begin by addressing our touchstone standard here. The first one that I think applies is classical educator. If we look at, for example, an ineffective classical educator, and what that means, an ineffective classical educator understands how the logic stage, which is what students are employing in the middle school, builds on the grammar stage that they got in the elementary and starts to prepare them for the rhetoric stage, which they'll enter in high school. In other words, they grasp the trivium, but they don't employ it. They understand the value of formal logic, but they don't build their curriculum, and they don't embed their instruction with Socratic questioning, activities that target critical thinking, the use of logic, evidence to support ideas and claims. Whereas an effective classical educator does apply those classical principles to all areas of their teaching. They develop their curriculum and plan their instruction with the use of logic and critical thinking and logical analysis in mind as kind of pillars or the bedrock of their curriculum and instruction. And I think there's a few tools that we can use as educators to develop those skills. Socratic seminars would be chief among them, because a Socratic seminar is run on, it's essentially a formal logic lesson where students are collaboratively using structured argumentation in order to build an understanding. So, the foundation of a good Socratic seminar or the Socratic method when you're instructing is the use of questions. An ineffective teacher really doesn't vary their question strategies. Here at the middle school level or in the logic phase, we want to, we'll certainly use recall-based or factual questions, but we also want to get into questions that are going to move beyond those lower Bloom's levels and encourage our students to begin thinking critically, reflecting on their own understanding, evaluating their own understanding of the concepts that we're teaching. And so we have to get into those higher Bloom's level tasks and questions here at the middle school level in the logic phase. I want to begin by exploring this quote. Winston Churchill. He said, "I love to learn, but I don't always love being taught." And I'm sure everyone can empathize with that sentiment on some level. I know I can. When I think back to my college experience, I certainly had professors who loved to teach or teach at us and not encourage us to learn and engage with the curriculum in meaningful ways. That was exciting. As a teacher, I always strove to design lessons where my students could learn in a way that they would be actively engaged in the process of that learning, instead of me just teaching at them. And I think one really effective way to do that, perhaps the most effective way, is to employ what's called the Socratic method. The Socratic method is a sort of generalized teaching technique that we can use during teacher-led instruction. It's a form of dialectic or disciplined questioning intended not to lecture towards our students, but rather to provoke thought within them and help students refine their own ideas in the process. Socrates himself claimed that through elenchus, or cross-examination, he could help others discover truth for themselves, not by spoon-feeding them answers, but by helping them examine their own beliefs. It's a simple process. He would begin by asking his students probing questions to kind of uncover some contradictions that they had in their own understanding. And he would challenge their definitions, testing them in different scenarios, looking for weak points in their understanding. And then he would use logic to reveal flaws in their thinking. And by employing one or all three of these techniques, he would sort of coach his students, gently guide them towards an understanding rather than teaching at them, rather than talking down to them or teaching in a way that feels condescending. Or another way to think about this is, if you're doing all the heavy cognitive tasks as the teacher, if you're doing the heavy lifting up here and they're just passive listeners absorbing it like a sponge, it's not going to stick. It's not going to last. But rather, when you ask your students to do that heavy cognitive work instead, that's when things stick. That's when transfer of learning occurs. Here's an example. Maybe you're a civics teacher and one of your students says, well, I think democracy is always the best form of government. I think the temptation as a teacher, or the immediate reaction of a teacher, is to say, well, I don't think that's true. Let me go ahead and list other forms of government that are perhaps better in different scenarios. I'm teaching at them. I'm doing the heavy cognitive work there. I'm thinking about it and then just saying it. Socrates wouldn't have done that. If a student said democracy is always the best form of government, he might say, well, let's examine that. Should people with no knowledge of an issue be allowed to vote on that issue? And hopefully, if you've done a good job of creating a classroom culture of academic rigor and honesty and humility, your student would pause and reflect and eventually say, well, no, probably not. People without knowledge of an issue shouldn't legislate on it. And then you could follow that up again, keep pushing, keep probing, and say, well, should democracy always be used then, even if it gives power to the uninformed? And your student would hopefully come to that understanding on their own, that, well, no, maybe we should use representative democracy sometimes. Maybe a republic is better in, certain circumstances. The point is, you're getting them to do that cognitive work. This process, called meiodics, is from a Greek word which means midwifery. Socrates' mother was a midwife, and of course he would have seen this, and he really liked that metaphor. He liked the metaphor of himself as a midwife. He saw himself as helping his students to deliver truth, capital T, as it were, for themselves. And the engine that he used to drive this within his students was the force of logic. Logic, he said, reveals contradictions. He wanted to highlight inconsistencies in his students' reasoning and prompt his students to do that critical reflection so that they could gain clarity of their own understanding. Logic guides discovery. Questioning our students helps them construct their own understanding through reasoning rather than just through constant correction. You're more of a guide by their side, helping them to do that heavy lifting. Logic demands precision. Learners are challenged to define terms for themselves, clarify assumptions, avoid vague claims, any kind of vagary. It forces you to examine evidence and re-examine theories or hypotheses in light of new evidence. It builds in complexity. When you employ that step-by-step questioning, you help your students move from a sort of surface level, simple premise to a deeper insight, a more nuanced understanding of whatever concept you're teaching. And maybe this is the most important, more important now than ever. It helps your students understand what civil disagreement is and what it looks like. Shared reasoning norms encourage respectful, evidence-based dialogue, and that's not going to happen right away in your classroom. It's a culture that you have to build over the course of the year, and it's one of the most important goals that we aim for when using Socratic seminars. So what is a Socratic seminar then? If the Socratic method is just sort of this informal process of asking probing questions, getting your students to do the heavy cognitive work, a Socratic seminar is a more formalized, structured, student-led dialogue that explores ideas through open-ended questions and textual evidence. It's really organized, in other words. Students are going to be assigned roles. You'll have posted clear norms, hopefully established in advance. Typically there's a circular seating arrangement involved. Every student participates civilly and thoughtfully, and you'll have to teach them and show them what that civil and thoughtful participation looks like. I've highlighted these terms here, student-led, open-ended, because when I first heard about Socratic seminars, these concepts, the idea that students would be leading the dialogue and it would be based on open-ended questions, that kind of scared me, kind of freaked me out a little. And it kind of seems like the facilitator or the teacher doesn't know where this argument is going to go, where this conversation is going to end up. But that's not really the case. I like this quote. If you aim at nothing, you're going to hit it every time. And that's the truth. As a teacher, you always want to have that crystal clear learning objective. You want to know in advance exactly what critical understandings you want your students to be in possession of at the bell. So how do we do that if we have a student-led dialogue happening involving open-ended questions? Well, think of it like a roadmap. If your lesson is a roadmap, you definitely have a clear destination in mind. You have those learning objectives crystal clear in your mind, and you kind of backwards plan the questions that you're going to ask as a facilitator of this seminar in advance, so that you can use those questions and evidence from the text in order to get them to that place. So you definitely aren't starting from a position of, well, we'll just see where this goes. No, you know exactly where you want this kind of conversation to go, and it's your job to guide students to that place with questions. I want to talk about norms real quick. These are some norms that you'll want to teach to your students before you have the first seminar. Teach them to speak to the group, not just to the teacher or one person. Base your responses on the text, not just opinion. I'll finish these up here in just a second. I have to pause this video and start session 2.